Oh, one, we've given it that extra hour, that extra minute into extra hour. Welcome today to Aparo's Navigating the Crisis webinar series. We're grateful that you're here and that we can provide some sort of support to you during this rather trying and unique time in our lives. We're grateful for all of the work that you're doing in the community to lift those who are suffering so much during this time. And we're also grateful that you want to come here and be community with us. You are all on mute. But the chat line is open and I will be monitoring it. And my name is Kim Lanfear. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Aparo. And for those of you who don't know Aparo, Aparo serves other nonprofits in the greater Charlotte market in 16 counties. And we work to create partnerships for nonprofits to enable them to more effectively deliver their missions through skilled volunteering engagements with technology and business process professionals. So with that, I am excited that today's conversation is going to be talking about how to maximize communications with your board during times of crisis. And I'm equally excited to just sort of introduce, I'm going to let her introduce herself more, a great personal friend and an incredible professional who's recognized around the country for her skills in nonprofit management and consulting and fundraising, Andi Stevenson, from Stevenson Wallace. I'll turn it over to you, Andi.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm going to stop my share and turn it to you to share, okay?
Perfect. Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, hopefully you can see the screen in the background. I am delighted to be with you. As Kim said, I am the founder and principal of Stevenson Wallace. Before that, I had 25 years in the nonprofit sector, 11 of them as an executive director, including I had the great fortune to be a first-time executive director. And I took that job here in Charlotte 11 months before the 2008 financial crisis. So I come at this with the only other thing that we have as a frame of reference, living through the Great Recession then, which, as you all know better than I do, is not even a really helpful parallel right now. This is, and this would be the first thing I would say to all of you, in addition to thank you for what you're doing. This is unprecedented. There is no handbook. On the off chance you're being hard on yourself right now, give yourself enormous amounts of grace. I'm talking to my clients all over the country, and everyone is in roughly the same position of, we've never done this before. There's no handbook. We don't know what we're doing. And if really, really talented professionals are not always sure of the next step, relative to our conversation today, your board members most assuredly are not sure what the next step is. So I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about just a framework to think about how you communicate with your board, because it can feel like flailing a little bit in terms of trying to get their attention, figuring out what they need to pay attention to, what do you need to tell them, in what order. So I would love to just kind of start with this process and start with a three-step framework. So you can think of this as a loop because we are in this for the long haul. So think of this as you work with your board, 3 steps, in sequence, although you'll be repeating pieces of this as you go along. The first one is clarifying the current state, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. This is in the early stage of any kind of a crisis. This is the point at which the board is trying to get their arms around what's even happening. This may be board members suddenly trying to tell you everything about the loans that are available from the federal government. This could be them saying, I need an hourly report on the bank balance. This could be, how many employees do we have? How many are full-time? How many are part-time? Things that theoretically they should have known coming into this, but don't. So the first state is really figuring out how to answer the questions about where you are now and get your arms around what it is and communicate that to the board in a way that gives them some confidence that they at least know what current state is. Because they will frequently attempt to jump to phase 2, which is considering scenarios. And what I'm seeing all over the country right now are executive directors who have board members who are trying to jump to scenario planning without first understanding the current state. Saying, well, what happens? When do we reopen? What if it's May? What if it's June? What if it's July? What if we lay these people off? What if we don't do this? And they're doing it without the knowledge to do it, which is making several executive directors just a little crazy at the moment. Skipping to understanding or considering scenarios before you've really got everyone on the same page with a shared understanding of your current state is incredibly frustrating. But it is a place that volunteer board members jump to very frequently. They want to get into the what if because they feel like they need to be generative and plan, which is wonderful, but not without everyone being on the same page about current state. Once you get to considering scenarios, then the third stage is out loud and intentionally sequencing the critical decisions that have to be made. And we'll talk about what that looks like. Without a calendar, without a written page that says, by April 15th, we have to decide this. By the third week of May, we have to decide this. You know, if this happens, then we have a week to decide this. All of those potential critical strategic and organizational decisions need to be on a page. You need to get your arms around when the critical decisions have to be made, otherwise it feels like a flood. So this is kind of the three-step process, and I'm gonna work through some of these, and then we'll talk about them and do questions. But I wanna start with clarifying current state. Okay, this is the response to what some of you are probably seeing, which is either, there might be three options. Disconnection from the board. I'm hearing from a lot of people that they've got board members who have sort of turned and fled and are either not engaging or not participating, and they don't really know what to do at this point. So making sure they understand the current state of things, including what you need the board to be doing, that's part of clarifying the current state. That's important for the board members who might be checking out right now. I've heard from several clients that they've got kind of 10 to 15% of their board that is ghosting a little bit. And that could be because of what's going on in their lives or because they're afraid and they don't know what to do. But if you have some board members who just disappeared and went poof in the last 2 or 3 weeks, you are not alone. This is also really important for board members who are just operating out of a state of panic and fear. The ones who take their governance responsibility incredibly seriously and don't know what to do. So they think they should be doing something, and they're going to want to skip to scenario planning, but getting them grounded in current state is important. This is also really important for those of you who have and are very talented executive directors who are trusted by your board, as you should be, to deal with the logistics and the tactical. This is a moment when boards that have trusted their executive directors and they have not gotten down in the weeds and they've really managed that good boundary between what's staff and what's board, that is so good 99% of the time. But this is also a moment where suddenly, especially for a complex organization, the board realizes how much they don't know about the microscopic day-to-day. And so containing and organizing and clarifying for them what they need to know about the current state is huge for the ones who are disengaged, for the ones who are afraid and want to be engaged, and for the ones who suddenly realize they could not tell you how many employees you have if you asked them. So those are kind of the three groups that this is important for. The temptation here is to clarify the current state for them financially. And it's really important to clarify first, whenever you're doing this on a page, and we'll talk about what some of these can look like, is the first thing on the page is programmatically, what is your current state? Which programs are operating? Which ones, if you are an organization like crisis assistance, have suddenly skyrocketed? Which ones have demand that has gone through the roof? Which ones suddenly there is no demand and you cannot produce them anymore? Which ones have been shut down because it's a public gathering? It's really important that when you do these updates for the board, the first thing on it is programmatic, because the temptation is about money. That can be the second thing, but it's really important to help them remember what's happening programmatically first. Then what is the impact having on the people you serve? So if you are a community service organization and you have had to close maybe a health clinic, include in an update what is happening to those people. What are their alternatives? Where do you think they're going? If you've had to stop a program or a service, include just a bullet point about what is the impact that this has had on the people you're serving. And then the thing that some of them skip to is obviously, what is your financial position right now? What's liquid? How much cash is accessible? What's your burn rate? What has been your burn rate? What have you got? What's the status of all of your employees? Some of you have already done the rounds of layoffs. I talked to one of my clients in Minneapolis. They went on Monday from 78 to 40 full-time staff and from 200 part-time staff to 8. That is not unusual for what I'm seeing right now. So some of you are going to be updating what is the status of your employees for your board on a weekly basis. As you're making decisions and maybe shifting people from full to part-time, or if you're having to do layoffs, it's important that the board is getting that information on a weekly basis so they know what that looks like. So there are other things that can be in this list in terms of clarifying the current state. But what does that look like? This is an option for you to take and consider. Some of you are already doing it. I like the idea of a weekly one-page dashboard update if you're not doing it already. I like a 3-column format where you're listing what you're updating down the left. You've got this week, you've got last week, and you've got a column that says, I'm going to explain what changed. So an example of that would be cash on hand. What is it this week? What was it this time last week? What's the variance? For my client in St. Paul, it would be number of full-time employees. Here's how many we've got. Here's how many we had last week. And a note that says, we exercised layoffs and we went through this many in which department. Legislative and bailout news. What have you heard? What's your rate of incoming donations? What's happening? So many of you have spring galas. You know, you're going to need to keep the board updated on how many of those sponsors are still in, which ones maybe agreed to give you the money and let you keep it for a future rescheduled event, use it for something else. But a really simple kind of 1 page, 1 day a week, just make it your update day, where you've got all your critical dashboard elements down the left side. What's true today? What was true 7 days ago? And what's the variance? Also, if you've got either an executive committee or a chair who you think can speak for the board, or a small group of people on a governance committee you like, ask them what information they want to see. That will add validity to it. They'll feel like they helped shape what actually is on that piece of paper. That also is a place where you're going to have to exercise boundaries. Because if they start asking to see information that is extremely tactical and that the board doesn't need to be in, you have to play hockey goalie defense and keep them out of that microscopic level on that kind of an update page. You know, they need to be up at the level of cash, program, number of employees, dollars, not down in decisions that you're making as a CEO. So managing that boundary is also critical with your chair. And I'm going to say this on the assumption that you have a strong chair. When we get to the discussion, we can talk about what happens if you do not at the moment have a strong chair. One of the things that I have loved, there's a great Harvard Business Review article about how to be a great board chair, and it's for corporate board chairs. But it's so true for the nonprofit sector, and it is the CEO or executive director runs the organization's operations. The board chair runs the board. In a perfect world, your board chair understands that they are responsible for rallying the board, telling the board what it needs to do, getting them going in the right direction, keeping them engaged, getting them motivated. That's rare. That's a perfect world. But this is an opportunity to sit with your board chair and say, let's talk about, because you are the chair of the board, you are the ringleader of all these volunteer board members, theoretically. Be very clear with them about which updates are coming from you, which are coming from them. You know, do you get a sequence where you're sending out this dashboard update every Friday, and shortly after that, your board chair does a reply all and says, based on this, and on my conversations with the CEO, here's what we need from this board in the next week. You know, what we want to do is get you in a position of, you're the expert, you run the organization, you're the provider of information. you shouldn't also have to cattle prod your board members to do their job at this particular moment of crisis. You should hopefully have a board chair or at least a governance committee chair who takes some responsibility for the nudging and for answering the question, okay, if this is this week's update on clarifying your current state, what does the board need to do? So that's a little bit on clarifying the process going forward. After everyone fully understands the current state, which we can talk a minute about how many variables we still don't understand right now, then the board at some point is able to consider staff-created scenarios.
Andi, I'm going to stop you for just a second because there's a lot of great information here. And I will tell you, as someone who has worked with Andi, I have already input some. I've had the wonderful benefit of having some of this information just a little bit earlier, and I've already started putting some of these in, but I'm learning more today. So I'm even going to be better next week than I have been these last couple. But I just wanted to call out to folks that we do have the chat open. If you want questions, please let me know. And then I can interject it as we go along. You've got a shout out in here from Anne Marie, who's saying she's worked with you and you're amazing. And if you haven't had an opportunity to do that, to work with Andi, she's a great resource for you. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Andi so we can continue. But I just wanted to make sure you knew we can take your questions as we go along through the middle.
And please, I tell Kim this all the time, unless you insult my dogs, I am impossible to offend. So if you're sitting there thinking, okay, yeah, she skipped over that and that would have been useful, don't even bother trying to make it sound polite. Just type it in the chat. I won't see it. Just say, I need her to go back and do this, this, and this, and tell Kim, and Kim will get me knocked back onto the right track. Scenario consideration, possibly the most important thing on this slide is the word staff created. If you wish to bring board members in to the creation of scenarios, if the world reopens and public gatherings are okay in June, then we can do this or we can do that. If you want to bring board members into that, that is absolutely up to you. I would strongly encourage everyone to start with the assumption that the staff builds those scenarios. This is a great deal like strategic planning and even budget preparation every year. The on-the-ground knowledge of what works and what doesn't and what might work and what couldn't in an organization belongs to the staff. So helping the board understand that when you have enough information to create scenarios, those scenarios are going to come from the staff to be discussed by the board is hugely important. You will probably have at least 5 or 10% of your board that might have the running around panicked, we have to think about all possible scenarios, let me help you generate 9 possible paths forward. Use your board chair or your governance chair, if you've got good ones, to help clarify. Scenarios need to come from the staff. You can create them and then polish them with your board chair. You can create them and polish them with an executive committee, but the germ of every scenario needs to come from the staff because you're the only people who know what might actually work on the ground. But then the board can consider them. These are the scenarios that are literally keeping everybody up at night. You know, what are the 6 scenarios for how long your operating cash reserves might work if you kept all your employees, if you laid them off, if you had to stay closed through July, if you reopened June 1st? This is that kind of scenario planning. Some of you have probably already gotten to this and hopefully done the clarifying the current state because you've already had to deal with cash flow and some of you have already had to deal with layoffs at this point. So some of you have already done this. That doesn't mean you can't go back and backfill and start maybe a weekly dashboard communication. It just means scenario planning is infinitely easier if you've gotten the whole board on the same page about what's true now before you get started on this. Again, give yourself grace. This is messy. This is the messiest thing I've seen in 28 years in the nonprofit sector. Everybody's flying by the seat of their pants. So if some of these come out of order and you go back and you backfill and then you do them a little differently, give yourself grace on that because this is going to be a challenge. When we talk about which programs can be restarted and which cannot, that is not an immediate crisis scenario, usually. It's something where, since most nonprofits are reduced or slowing down right now, you may have a little more time to think about that. But if you're making the decision about which ones to shut or reduce right now, then you're actually having to consider that at the moment, because you're trying to decide which ones are easiest to bring back later. There are 100 potential scenarios to consider, and we'll talk about those in a little while. The most important thing is, once you've gotten a grip at the board level and gotten them feeling really confident that they understand the current state, then they can do this. If you try to get them to think about scenarios and they don't understand the current state, you'll be trying to consider scenarios and they will be hijacking the conversation by saying, well, how many employees do we have? Well, how much cash do we have? Well, what's our ability to tap into our endowment? If you can clarify all that before you get to meaningful scenario consideration with them, it makes the scenario consideration so much cleaner and faster, and it makes you, not want to hurl a stapler and think, I told you that. We should know that. Let's focus on getting everybody on the same page and up to speed, and then work on scenarios. So,
Andi, you've been meeting with the same CEOs as me, because that hurl of stapler is right there in my scenario. We have a question about, will we see a sample weekly dashboard in this presentation?
You will not see it in this presentation, but I bet I could crank one out and get it to you by probably tonight. And then Kim, you could send it to everybody if you know who's on the call. Would that work?
Sure can do it.
Okay, so the key here is managing, and you know this intuitively, I just wanted to give shape to it. When you're looking at scenarios, you are probably overwhelmed in your own right, and this is your million-hour-a-week paid job and your professional expertise. The board has never lived through this. They're volunteers. This isn't their gig, and most of them have never run a nonprofit. So it's important, when you're finally getting to the place of putting scenarios in front of the board, manage the number of scenarios you give them to consider. This is going to be really difficult because we don't know reality. Right now, the funnel of possibilities is so giant that it's really hard to narrow this down. But be very mindful of the number of scenarios they can consider. When I do strategic planning, I try not to put more than about 4 scenarios in front of a board at a time. Right now, in any of your organizations, there are probably 36 scenarios that might actually happen. So think about the timing. Can you use a couple of them as representative of general directions? Do you need to wait before you do scenarios? Think about that. So the number of scenarios you need to consider. The confidence you have in the likelihood of the scenarios. And this is more art than science. Do you feel, before you put scenarios in front of any group, do you feel like you've thought of everything and you have your arms around all the possibilities? This has to be the one that is so specific to this crisis. In the financial crisis in 2008 and also 9/11, I was with a different organization. You sort of understood what reality would be like. You sort of understood as it was happening, okay, people are being laid off, but there's going to be a moment where we all go back to functioning. Stores will be open during the financial crisis. People might have less money, but you sort of understood. 9/11, everything closed for several weeks. You came back. Some industries were affected more than others. The number of possibilities of what might happen feels like it changes every time there's a briefing about which state closed down and how many deaths we might expect and when the social distancing might come up. This is the thing that is so unique to this problem, is you're all going to have to use your best judgment to feel like, okay, I feel like I've got enough information that I can at least say, I have an idea of what all the crazy possibilities might be. There's been a lot of talk this week about we might come out of this in June or July, and then there might be another round in the winter. 3 weeks ago, no one was talking about that. So that's a new possibility that's come up. Being flexible with this, and again, to Kim's point, occasionally hurling a stapler, also fine. And one of the other critical ones is the timing of when the scenarios are presented to the board. The temptation is to present scenarios to the board sooner rather than later. And sometimes you might wind up presenting them when your confidence is low, like you don't really feel like you've had enough time to get your brain around it. Or you go in and you say, we haven't really been able to narrow these. Here are 12 scenarios. We're not really sure these are even all of the 12. What do you think? In terms of board dynamics, it's almost impossible to get a good conversation out of that. You know, board dynamics are really good when they have a limited number of options and fairly good confidence that those are at least the broad scenarios. There might be 7 variations inside of we're closed until June and then we reopen. There might be 14 variations of we have to do layoffs to get down to a skeleton staff to survive until the fall, but that's a scenario. Can you do some roll-up scenarios so that they can wrestle with those? Make sure they have confidence that you've gotten through most of the scenarios and gotten your arms around as many possibilities as you can, and that you're not presenting a number of scenarios that will make the board either feel like they can't choose or feel overwhelmed, or suddenly start doing the Frankenstein where you've put 9 options in front of them and they start picking one piece of all 9 and you're sitting there thinking you can't patch those together, it doesn't work that way. That happens sometimes if you give them too many. So think about that. And these are phrases that may or may not come up in this process. Whenever I've done scenario plannings with my own boards, is you usually have to play defense in explaining the process. You have to say out loud the most effective process, and even you can say best practice here is that staff will vet the scenarios because they're the professionals on the ground and in the industry, and we will bring the 3 or 4 most likely scenarios to the board. You're probably going to have to say that out loud and set that boundary so that the board isn't trying to be generative about that. The next 2, there are 1,000 variations on these. There will be pieces of the scenarios or entire scenarios that you don't know enough about to do right now and that the board may push. And finding a way to say, we simply don't know enough about the timeline right now to do that kind of scenario planning. We simply don't know enough, this has been huge this week, we simply don't know enough about the timing of when these emergency payroll preservation loans might get to us to understand how that's going to help us. You know, everyone is sorting through that right now, and we're still trying to figure out how do you do scenario planning when you don't know how fast the check is going to get here. So making sure that you're really candid with them about, we just don't know enough about that piece of this to plan for that right now. And then this goes back to strategic planning. This is true of mission and vision statements. I love writing and supporting the writing of mission and vision statements in strategic planning for my clients. But the first rule is when you come into the room with options for mission and vision statements, never bring one into the room for the board to look at that you can't live with them choosing. And try to have a fairly clear recommendation about which ones the staff feel would be strongest. That applies here too. If you're going to bring 4 potential scenarios, 4 potential options or strategies in front of the board, it's absolutely appropriate to say the professional staff's recommendation would be one of these 2. Or we think these 2 are most likely out of the 4 or 5. Therefore, we need the board to focus its time on these 2, but we wanted you to be aware of the others. Or within these, we recommend this kind of action fairly soon, and here's what we might need for the board. This is not the moment to bring a bunch of options in front of the board and kind of toss it out like a buffet and hope they pick a good one. This needs the phrase, the staff's professional recommendation is. Don't feel like you're overstepping at that point. You're engaging them in the conversation, but they want to hear from you because again, they're freaked out because they're volunteers and they've never done this. So giving them a way to be participatory and engage in the conversation and talk about scenarios is really important, but don't make them do it flying blind. Do it with some staff recommendations as well. I'm going to stop and ask Kim if there's anything popping up in the chat window before we go to the next one.
There's nothing popping up now, but people are welcome to put questions in there if they'd like to.
Okay. I'm going to be asking you questions in a little while, so get ready with the chat function. Okay, this is the one that can be very daunting, although at this moment, all of it's daunting, especially if you have a good board chair or a good governance committee chair. Trying to create a clear written timeline of what the organizational decisions that need to be made are and when. This sounds like I've just gone full, way too organized on this. This is actually really important for the board, and especially your board chair, to have confidence that they know what the decisions coming are. One of the challenges institutionally we're going to face between now and the end of the year, at least, is a sense of being overwhelmed by the number of decisions you have to make. Some of you are already there. On a pretty regular basis, my clients are saying to me, I had to decide what to do about this, and we're trying to decide what to do about that, and wine consumption is high because of that. Getting your arms around and putting on paper as much as possible after you've considered the scenarios. And the scenario consideration process surfaces what those decisions are. Clarifying current state also surfaces a lot of what those decisions may be, because if you know you're running out of cash at a certain point, then you can reverse engineer which decisions might have to be made before then. Truly getting on one page. Okay, on May 1st, we have to make a decision about this. On April 30th, on June 1st, by this date, we'll have to make a decision about canceling the gala. Getting all that on one page. And that could be programmatic. It could be about laying off staff. It could be, what are you doing if you have a massive physical plant? It could be, when do you think, if things don't get better, you're going to have to launch an emergency fundraising appeal? Some organizations have already done that. Getting that on paper is hugely comforting for the board. It may be comforting for you too. It is incredibly comforting for the board. It also helps you see, as you try to wrestle that to the ground, how all your critical decisions are intertwined and which ones have to be made first in order to make the ones later down the road. So it also raises the question, does the board and the executive staff have good muscle memory and skill at saying, is that really the decision we need to make now? That's a huge question for the board to consider. Is this really the decision we need to make now? Because you will have board members constantly trying to make decisions that you don't need to make right now, or not wanting to make decisions that you do need to make right now. So asking the question, and you can enlist your board chair or your governance committee chair or task your executive committee and just say, I need you to be the people who constantly ask, is that really the decision we have to make right now? Because getting the decisions in the right order is as important as what the decisions are. I've actually already got a client who did one round of layoffs, missed a window for when she would have to do the next round based on the next pay period, because they didn't make that decision early enough, and it's now having a financial impact on them. They'll do the next round of layoffs in April, but because she didn't make the next round decision early enough, she missed a place where they could have split it between pay periods, and it would have been much easier for them financially. So getting a sense of the timeline for all the decisions so that you don't miss those critical moments is important for you. It's even more important for the board to understand what decisions they're going to be asked to make. Okay, so just a few things about this before we kind of get to questions and where you all are. Knowing where the board is in the process, every board member being able to say, okay, every Friday we're getting a clarification of our current state. Our next task after this will be looking at scenarios that the staff brings us. And as soon as we can, we've got a list of the critical decisions to be made. Knowing where you are in that process is the thing that gives board members confidence, because right now, this feels like those giant photographs of the entire Milky Way galaxy. Everything's just floating and spinning. Everybody's getting 400 email about business loans and nonprofits in Charlotte that are laying people off. There's a lot of spinning going on right now. And as much as you can give structure, even as simplistic as this may seem to some of you, as much as you can give structure to how the board needs to think about what it's doing, that the board can articulate, we're getting these updates on current staff, we're about to do scenario planning, we're sequencing, that is what gives them confidence to actually step in and do work. When they lose confidence, they'll ghost you because this is terrifying and they don't know what to do. So knowing where the board is in the process is even more important than where it actually is. This is also going to be a loop. That's the other thing that makes this crisis so different. We're probably going to go through this multiple times, even in April, May, and June. We might get a break, God forbid this virus comes back at some point. We'll do the whole thing again. So establishing a process early is going to be helpful for every version of this that we do. And the boards are looking for maps. If you keep that in the back of your head, they want a roadmap. They want to understand what comes next and where they're supposed to go. And there is no map. We all know there is no map. This is absolutely singular and traumatic for the nonprofit sector. There is no map, but as much as you can give them structure or a framework that might feel like a map, you're winning, and you can keep them engaged a little bit better. As much as possible, every time you talk to the board, talk about this process. You know, if you've got a board call or a committee call, start with, okay, I want to take a few minutes and clarify current state so you know what's happening and how it's changed since last week. Let me tell you the information we need in order to start scenario planning, and then let's talk about the decisions that need to be made. Talk about it out loud. This is not a stealth executive director tool that you never mention to the board. You know, it's not behind the scenes. Out loud is what gives them confidence in this kind of a crisis. You can also think about adapting it for how you communicate with your staff. And in that case, go very, very heavy on clarifying current state. You are the best judge of how transparent to be with your own staff with challenging news. You cannot over communicate to the staff what's happening. And for those of you with larger organizations that might have silo issues, do not assume that necessarily your marketing or your IT team understands which programs got shut down or suspended. Or, again, if you're crisis assistance, where demand has blown through the roof and people might be working 12 and 14-hour days every day, don't expect back office to understand that. Communicating with the entire team about what's happening on a regular basis and clarifying current state is huge. So when I create said template, you can use it for both board and staff. And then if you're using it for board, you're using it for staff, also think about using it to manage your own thinking. I had a little while in the 2008 financial crisis where my own thinking did not have structure. And my own thinking usually doesn't have structure at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And especially if you're given to catastrophizing, as some of us are, and some of us live in worst case scenario. I never live in best case scenario. I always live in worst case scenario. Use it to manage yourself a little bit too. Know in your own brain if you start to panic about this, or as you're trying to sort through 700 things you have to do, what are you doing that's clarifying your current state or trying to alter your current state? What are you doing that is forward-looking scenario planning? Most of us enjoy one of those more than the other. Everybody's wired to like worrying about the current moment or to be a future person a little differently. Allow yourself to say, okay, I don't enjoy that, I enjoy
Andi?
that. Manage your
Andi?
time going back and forth.
Andi?
And think about sequencing your decisions. Yes, I'm here.
Step back and do just a little bit of that again. We lost your voice just a little bit there for just a second.
Oh, good. Okay, so where did you lose me?
Just right at the very end, is that some of us catastrophize, some of us are, you know, and right at the conclusion of that, we kind of, you faded in and out.
I love that I was talking about catastrophizing, and that's when my IT quit on me. That seems appropriate.
It fits, doesn't it?
It really does. It's really just about how do you use it to manage your own thinking. Give yourself the framework. All people are good or better at one of those three phases. Some people are very oriented to the moment, and so they're going to love clarifying current state. What am I doing right now? What does it look like? What's the snapshot? What can I do to improve right now? Some people are very future oriented and love options, and so scenario planning is where their brain wants to go. And some of you are very much in need of trying to pull down out of the sky the 700 decisions you need to make and get them on paper in order. So use it to kind of manage where you're spending your energy and your brain. And again, I cannot say this enough, cut yourself some slack. If you know you don't love scenario planning, you don't really have to pretend you love scenario planning. You have to do it, and you have to reach out with other resources in your organization, but manage your time, that after you do that, you get to go back to something that's a little more natural for your brain. Like, don't forget, in the middle of all this, no one is good at all of it. No one is good at all of this. So understand that you're going to enjoy some things more than others and try to manage that time. Okay, before we go to group wisdom, Kim, do you have questions? Do we have questions from chat? I kind of wanted to ask some questions about what's happening with the people on the line.
I have not seen questions come through yet. People are listening intently because nobody's left. And I'm loving your owls, so we could just stay on this page for a while.
Okay, so I'll ask, and I'll make Kim be my guinea pig, because I wanted to ask the group, and you can answer in the chat, but I'll pick on Kim in the meantime. What has worked well so far, and what has been a challenge in communicating your current reality to board members? As you're thinking about that and possibly chatting, I will offer up what I'm hearing from a few of my clients. One of them has said their great challenge is that they send out information to their board about current state, and it's crickets. You know, they might get back a couple emails that say, well, thank you. Okay. What you want is for that to be more of a dialogue where you've got maybe your board chair or your governance committee chair tacking on to that and saying, okay, here's where the board fits into this current state. Several of my clients have said that their board is just kind of petrified, or they're quarantined, or they've got a sick family member, or their business might be going under and they're just checked out. So that's one of the main challenges I'm hearing right now.
Ooh. Okay.
What about you?
We have a lot of responses. Well, I just put out there that my board has gone immediately to scenario planning, which is what you might imagine from a bunch of IT leaders. But I also see them reacting to what's going on in their own environment. So many layoffs are happening that they want to know immediately what's going on. You know, we've got to figure this out now. And I'm seeing, let me just read to you what others are saying. I have full ghosting, no response from any board member. I have a lot of that too. I really do. The ones who aren't scenarioing are ghosting. I've been working primarily with executive committee, and I see I need to do more with the full board. If someone in your group contracts the virus, how should you handle the communication piece of that? I'm in ED and just crafted my scenarios for my board, but your insight's been helpful. I feel stronger that I can have a solid conversation with them now. What has worked well is communication with board chair. Getting ahead of any questions by addressing issues as soon as they occur. Most of my folks are banking and healthcare, so they are so preoccupied and not really checking in. And that's what I'm having too. I'm just having so many people I send them weekly updates. I'm sure they see it. I don't know how far they go into it, but they just feel like, okay, then I don't need to worry about it as long as I'm getting an update from Kim.
And you might, again, depending on your chair or your governance committee chair, you might ask your board chair to go Captain Obvious on this one. I mean, it might be a good time for the board chair to send an email to everybody on the board that says, you might be wondering what we need you to do in this crisis. Here it is. 1, read every single thing Kim sends to you. 2, we're going to be incredibly respectful of your time, and we will not ask for your time unless we really need board input and a board decision. So know that we're not going to overtax you during this incredibly stressful, national time for everyone. But 3, when we do need you, we need you to be in. I think for boards, you cannot be too obvious, and having your board chair or your governance committee chair or your chair-elect, that's what's also interesting, is so many of you were about to get new board chairs July 1st. And, you know, if they don't run screaming from the room, it's going to be a miracle. You know, have your chair, your chair-elect, or governance committee chair literally send an email to the board that says, here's what we need you to do in this crisis. Read everything Kim sends. Check in every now and then with the staff. Know that we're respecting your time and we're not going to put anything in front of you or call a meeting that doesn't really need to be had. But when we do need you, we need you to understand this is life and death for a lot of nonprofits. The numbers are really frightening. And I am such an optimist by nature, and I'm so frightened for the sector. And so what you need are board members who understand this is almost not strategic. This is almost just existential. And there's a difference. You have to figure out your strategy to continue to survive and exist, but they need to understand that this is not a blip. And that's better coming from a chair or a board member conveying the seriousness of that than it is from staff. Usually.
I love how you just outlined that exact thing that a board chair could do. That's very, very helpful. And what I'm seeing in the chat is a lot of ghosting. People, their boards are ghosting. There are a couple who are doing updates and they're not getting a lot of response. And on the other side of that, they have a few who are wanting to really deep dive. So I feel that pain. And then one is, it has seemed to have a really good response from their board members they're really engaged appropriately, and she's trying not to overtax them. So
you can also, this was my first communication to all my clients 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, was I reached out to most of them going back several years and just said, I wanted to see how you are. I'm thinking about you. I hope you're okay. You know, probably in another week or so, I'll reach back out. And my question for them is, are you okay? How are you? Are you healthy and safe? How are all the people you love? Now, I tend to be very high touch, close to my clients. I was always close to my board members. Pick a moment. If they ghost you, pick a moment to send individual emails to board members and just say, you are part of our organization's family. And on a personal note, I just wanted to see how you are and tell you I hope you, and insert names of spouses and children here, how everybody else is doing. You know, they may not know how to respond to a work email about the organization. They will probably appreciate you remembering that they're a live human in the middle of this. And that might get them to actually respond. So give your people who are ghosting you a little while and then send them a purely non-work email, which I'm offering that as a strategy for board development. It's really what we should all be doing just to be decent people. I mean, this moment is just all of us emailing and texting everybody we've ever cared about and saying, are you okay? What's going on? That applies to your board too. And it might happen to be a good way to get some of them to remember that you care about them. You're not just hitting them up to go suddenly raise crisis money. That they are a live human to all of you in the middle of this. That could help too. What else?
There's lots of conversation going on in chat amongst themselves.
Good.
Yeah. So
let me
talking about we're doing regular communications. I mean, I don't want to read out all out because everybody else can see the chat, so I don't want to.
Right. No, but that's good. That's good. This is why we do group learning and group wisdom at the end. I wanted to ask, what scenarios are people running now? Because this is the quicksand of the whole process. Like, we don't know enough to really run a normal set of scenarios. But everyone's still having to run some number of them, especially around who do we keep in terms of staff and what can we do and how long the cash holds out. So I thought I would at least ask, and Kim, I'll pick on you to get us started. If you're running scenarios right now, what are you running and what are you able to run?
We are not running yet. We're starting this week. And what I plan to start running is 6 month, 12 month, 18 month. And in each of those scenarios, I'm going to be overlaying 3 or 4 what ifs. What if the major fundraiser that we hope works every year, what if it doesn't come through? What if it comes through 50%? What if these new initiatives on fundraising that we have come through as hoped? What if they don't? And laying those over and then coming up with scenarios of, what do we do from there?
I will chip in here. Kim knows this. Because I've been watching all these clients that I adore kind of helplessly live through this. I've been sending out kind of once a week some framework or tips or something that's helpful to nonprofit EDs and other people in the sector. And if anybody wants to get on that email list, tell Kim and she'll send me your email and I'll send you whatever I think about that week that I think is useful to the sector. This is a good place to point out the one I did last week about strategic questions. When you do scenario planning, don't just think about your organization. We tend to do scenario planning about what can we do? How will our funding environment have changed? What if I have staff? What programs can I restart? Where will demand be for me? Those are all questions about our own organization. When you do scenario planning, be sure to work through scenarios about what is going to change for the people you serve, right? Right now we're in this mode of, oh my God, the world has changed for my organization. The world has changed for everyone who's ever bought a ticket to your museum or your performing arts organization right now. The world has changed for every parent at your nonprofit preschool. Be sure when you plan scenarios, you also plan what are the 15 ways that life might change for all the people we serve. They may not need what you do anymore. They might need you on a flood level when this comes back. And some of the questions around that are always, how have their needs changed? How have their resources to afford what they need changed? Who else is providing what they need? Did that landscape change? And is the timing of when they need it now different? And those questions look different for every different kind of nonprofit, but just don't forget when you're scenario planning to also think about there are probably 15 different ways the people you serve might be different on the back end of this, much less how your organization is going to be different.
And Andi, I don't know how much you can feed into this question, but it's been asked to ask, and I didn't ask. I read it, but I didn't give you time to answer it. If someone in your group contracts the virus, how would you recommend handling communication, the communication piece of that?
This is such a terrible collision of HIPAA and multiple other things. I have both in the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector. I have a friend in the for-profit sector whose buildings literally got evacuated when 2 of their people, and I mean, in a 400-person office, they got evacuated when their test came back positive, and they have not been back to their office since then. That was a blast email to everyone. That's not ideal. I would, as much as possible, work through what you know about if you have HR. If not, now would be a great time to try to avail yourself of HR expertise on your board. Those are the people who are going to be worth gold for the next 6 months, is anyone with HR expertise on your board. Partly because of layoffs, partly because of regrouping and rescaling up, and partly because of this. If you have someone in your group who has tested positive, your first and almost only commitment is to the safety of everybody else in the organization, and you know that. How you choose to communicate that is going to come after how you choose, and it will happen probably within a very short period of time, like less than an hour. You're going to have to decide, what does that mean for our operations? You know, have you been with that person in the last 2 weeks? Kim, how long have y'all been working from home? Well,
This is our third week.
So if someone on your team tested positive today, you're well outside the exposure window. So that's a different conversation than if everybody's in an essential organization and they're still going to the office. I think it's a matter of very quickly figuring out how does it affect the work so that when you announce it, either to the board or to the rest of the staff, you're announcing it with, and here are the actions we're taking. And as fast as possible, get good HR advice on it, because what I'm seeing are people emailing out which staff member is either home with it or sick or tested, and that feels like a HIPAA violation in a big way. Desperate times, but I would say start with HR and then figure that out, and figure out who's positive. Have they been around any board members? That's going to be important if you're having to tell the board that it's someone who has not been exposed to anyone on the board. That's their own self-interest. That's not a great answer because it's going to depend a little bit on when and who they've been exposed to and how long you've been home. But I will say, as much as possible, get good HR advice fast before you decide what to do about it. And try to protect everybody's privacy. What else?
So I have some people who are sending questions to just all panelists, and you really need to send it to all panelists and attendees so that we know what your people are sharing, if they're sharing information. And I have somebody who's raised a hand. Jennifer, is there a way we can let that person speak? I have no idea how to do that.
Yes, Sarah, we see that your hand is raised, and I've just enabled your microphone. So you might need to check on your screen to make sure that you're not muted, but I've unmuted you from our side.
But it will help us for others if you do your question in the chat, and I'll do my best to, get the question there for her. So go ahead, Sarah. Sarah, it sounds like your microphone's not on.
Yeah, it's.
So just send me the question in chat, Sarah. Type it out, and I'll get it out to the group.
Yeah, I don't know why we can't.
I've got some. Well, you guys can read this, but in here it says JOF Security Systems, who work with businesses and schools, offers a templated letter to use to share if someone has contracted the virus. I'll try to find the link.
Beautiful.
Great. And if you
Thank you.
Find that link, we can send that out as well to the group. So,
and that's also something you can ask even your non-HR board members. Like, I'm quite sure there have been all staff emails that have gone to Wells and B of A and Duke and major corporations and say, would you give us the templates of what you've received from your own HR department? Those can also be useful even from non-HR board members.
Someone has also asked, would you recommend that the current board chair stay in place for the next year if the organization documents, board members, and the current chair are in agreement?
If you like your current board chair.
I was going to say.
Yeah. This one's going to be,
get him to stay longer.
This one's going to be hard because there will be a real tendency. I was always very lucky. I had board chairs I loved. Obviously, Kim knows this. I have loved a couple of her board chairs as if they were my own. I think about all those people and I think, absolutely, my first request would be, can you please stay? You need a full board vote to do that if it is not in accordance with your normal terms. Extraordinary times justify that. Walk that one carefully if you are eager to shift board chairs. If you really do not have a board chair that you think is going to be a great leader during this crisis, beginning to shift already to your chair-elect and having that conversation very openly about, okay, it's very important that we maintain our system of changing leadership going forward. We want that consistency. We want to do it the way we've always done it. Let's make all of our meetings between the current chair, the chair-elect, and the executive director. And those become maybe our weekly calls or whatever they are. That one's tough. But absolutely, if you love your board chair, if you have a board chair who is willing to take responsibility for leading his or her fellow board members, and you want to stay, I would absolutely be in favor of that, because they know the landscape and the onboarding process isn't going to take up any time. If you need to make a change in your board chair anyway, be proactive about saying out loud, we need to adhere to our rotation procedures, but let's make it a smooth transition and let's have all three of us communicate at the same time. That one's up to you. I would never, never wish you a board chair who was not strong in this crisis, ever. And then this last slide that I pulled up was just me saying, and it sounds like you've got a few of these. Are there any premature decisions your board's trying to make now? It sounds like a lot of them are headed for scenario planning. Yes?
Well, it's interesting. Someone did say something, are there things that should be avoided? Someone asked, is there any suggestion about continuing to recruit new board members during this time?
I think it depends on where they are in the pipeline. And it depends on how you recruit your board members. If you are recruiting, can I pick? I'm going to pick for a minute. I'll pick on Jay Everett at Wells Fargo. If you are, and I certainly have done this, if someone at Wells Fargo is rotating off your board and you want to have someone from Wells Fargo on your board and you've gone to Jay and said, please help us find someone X, Y, and Z, that is going to be someone who's not already close to your organization.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a really hard thing to keep doing. And I don't know that that's useful, because I want your life to be easier. I don't want you to have to be onboarding strangers to the organization in the middle of this. That's really hard. So you may wind up asking some of your general board members to stay on into another year as well. If you have a whole slate that's about to roll off, you might consider trying to keep them as well as your chair. I'll pick on Kim. Almost nobody does the recruiting pipeline better than Aparo does. So they've got spreadsheets that'll blow your mind about potential board members for like the next 5 years. And they're on
spreadsheets too, if you want them.
Yes, and they're on committees, and they are, by the time they get on the board, they have been on committees, they've been involved, especially in the gala. Like, they're part of the family. They know the drill, they have minimal onboarding needs, they kind of know the culture. Those people I think you can keep going with. Just be very open with them about where you are. You might start, if they're close on the process, you might start sending them a separate email with some of your, here's the current state document every week. You can start sharing that information if you wish with them. I would put a pause on recruiting people who are not already sort of close and family, because what I wish for you is you don't need to be dealing with strangers on your board right now. You need to be dealing with people who know you and know the organization. But you can keep going with the ones that you know. I want to be mindful of time. Is there anything else?
People have asked whether the deck will be available and whether a recording of the webinar will be available, and yes to both. Aparo has a resources page, and on that page you can see, you can listen to the recordings from all of the webinars that happened. Last week we had an amazing forensic interviewer who talked about how to create influence under stress, particularly dealing with team members and board members who are dealing with stress, and how to help them navigate that and know when you need to help them navigate. So that's the last conversation. And Jennifer, what is next week's conversation?
Next week will be, pardon me, accessing tools to help you continue this remote work scenario for the long haul. We'll be looking at low cost and free tools to help people remain engaged with their constituents, boards, and volunteers.
So yes, you can get to the recordings and you will get the deck.
And I will do a mock-up of what I think of as a Friday email dashboard, and I will send it to Kim. I will include my email at the bottom if you want to get these exceptionally informal emails that I'm sending out. Let me know. Happy to put anybody on the list. And if you have specific questions around this, the rule is always, if you have sat through listening to me for an hour, you are more than welcome to send me questions, and I will, about your specific situation, and I will happily answer them and email you back and give you the best advice I can.
And you know, if you have sat through listening for an hour with Andi, that you have had a great experience and learned a lot, and that she is a wealth of information. So we can't say enough great about her. Thank you
Happy
all
to
so
help.
much for being here. And please let us know at Aparo how we can help you as you traverse this journey, and look forward to our next conversations each week. Same bat channel, same bat time. Great folks like Andi here helping lift the cause. Stay safe.
Thanks.